Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Here I'm going over the 1 o'clock games and doing a preview of each of them very quickly for Sunday, September 28th. So let's jump right into the first one, which is Washington at Atlanta. And back to the team panels, we have Atlanta favored at the money line with a spread of 1.5 and a total point line of 43.5. We have Washington with a passing rank of 17 and a rushing rank of 2. They are a rank of 25, meaning they're one of the worst teams in pass defense, and about average in the rushing rank of 12. Atlanta has a passing rank of 19, a rushing rank of 6, a allowed passing rank of 2, and a allowed rushing rank of 10. So they have an above average defense here. If we break those down, we have 213 passing yards per game for Washington and an average of 157 rushing yards. They've had no passing interceptions and suffer almost 3 sacks per game. And Atlanta has 211 passing yards per game with almost 140 rushing yards per game. They've had a few passing interceptions, 2 passing interceptions, and they suffer 1/3 sacks per game. Looking on the defensive side, Washington allows 249 average passing yards per game and an average of almost 100 rushing yards per game. Atlanta allows 148 passing yards per game and about 96 average rushing yards per game. And looking at the quarterback comparison, you have Marcus Mariota and Michael Penix because Jaden Daniels is still out. Mariota only had 1 game, of course, and in that 1 game he got 20.3 fantasy points compared to Michael Penix's 33.1 fantasy points over his 3 games. Mariota's had 1 sack in that 1 game, and Michael Penix has thrown 2 interceptions and had 4 sacks suffered in his 3 games. Looking at their averages, we had Mariota at 207 passing yards last game and 1 passing touchdown, and he had 40 rushing yards in that game. Michael Penix has almost been averaging 202 passing yards per game, and he's been averaging almost 10 rushing yards per game. His breakdown's been almost 300 passing yards and a passing touchdown in week 1, 135 passing yards in week 2 against Minnesota, and 172 passing yards against Carolina. For the running backs, on Washington's side, you have Krosky Merritt, and on Atlanta's side, you have Bijan Robinson. Merritt has had 25 fantasy points, and Bijan has had 26.3 fantasy points, 60 in PPR formats. Neither of them have had any turnovers, and looking at the season averages, you have Merritt with 41.6 average rushing yards per game, and averages just 2 receiving yards per game, while Robinson has almost 80 rushing yards per game, and 55 receiving yards per game. Bijan getting 143 in his second game with a low of 24 and 72 last game. Merritt with a high of 82 in the first game and a low of the second game of 17 and 26 in the last game. Next up, we have the receivers. We have Terry McLaurin out for Washington, so we can look at Debo instead. And Noah Brown's out, so Debo's kind of their only guy right now. And on the other side, we have Drake London. Debo's had 28.9 fantasy points, 44.9 in PPR, and Drake London's had a tougher start at 13.9 fantasy points, 29.9 PPR overall. Debo Samuel's had no turnovers, and Drake London's had 1. Looking at their averages, Debo Samuel actually gets a fair few carries, almost 1.5 per game, and gets about 12 yards per game on those rushing carries. On his receiving side, he gets on average 44 yards per game. Over here, Drake London gets on average 53 receiving yards per game, no carries. If we break them down, Drake London's had 55, 49, and 55, so very consistent with that number. Very interesting with the 15 targets the first week with 8 receptions. He does get the largest share of his team's receiving yards still. Over here with Debo, he had 77 the first week, 44 the second week, and only 11 last week. And he gets about 12.8% share of the yards, which is not the largest share, which would be Terry McLaurin, but he's out. And the tight ends with Zach Ertz on Washington and Kyle Pitts on Atlanta. Ertz with 24.8 fantasy points, 36.8 PPR, and Kyle Pitts with 13.5, 28.5 PPR. Neither of them have lost a fumble. On average, Kyle Ertz gets 42.6 receiving yards per game, while Kyle Pitts gets 45 receiving yards per game, so fairly evenly matched up there. Ertz with 26 and 1 touchdown in the first game, 64-1 in the second game, and 38 in the last game. Kyle Pitts getting 59 in the first game, 37 in the second game, 39 in the last game, and has not had a receiving touchdown this season yet. Kyle Pitts does get 13.6% of the receiving share, while Zach Ertz gets 16.9% of his team's receiving share. So Ertz may get more even too with the other two wide receivers hurt. And moving on to New Orleans at Buffalo. Here we have Buffalo heavily favored on the money line with a spread of 14.5 and a total point line of 48.5. Here you have New Orleans with a passing rank of 18 and a rushing rank of 17, so about right in the middle, and an allowed passing rank of 17 and a allowed rushing rank of 14, so also defensively right in the middle. For Buffalo, you have a passing rank of 6, a rushing rank of 1, an allowed passing rank of 1, and an allowed rushing rank of 32. So they have the best passing defense, but the worst rushing defense. They have the best rushing rank still, and pretty good in the passing rank offensively. So if we look at the averages, you have New Orleans averaging 213 average passing yards per game. With Buffalo, you have 262 average passing yards per game. New Orleans averages 100 rushing yards per game. New Orleans averages 102 rushing yards per game. And Buffalo averages 163 rushing yards per game. New Orleans has had 1 passing interception, and on average suffers 2 sacks per game. Buffalo has 0 passing interceptions, and on average suffers 1.33 sacks per game. Defensively, New Orleans allows 225 passing yards per game and allows 103 rushing yards per game. Buffalo allows 146 passing yards per game on average and allows 156 rushing yards per game on average. They both average about the same QB hits at 4, and they both average about 2 sacks per game, with New Orleans slightly higher at 2.6 average sacks per game. For the quarterbacks, we have Spencer Rattler on New Orleans, and you have Josh Allen for Buffalo. Spencer has 44.9 fantasy points this season, while Josh Allen has 73.6. Spencer has 1 passing interception and has had 6 sacks suffered, almost lost a sack fumble, while Josh Allen has had no turnovers. Looking at their averages, we have 213 average passing yards per game for Spencer Rattler and 251.6 average passing yards per game for Josh Allen. Spencer also has 17.6 average rushing yards per game, while Josh Allen has 38 average rushing yards per game. Again, a quick breakdown of the week by week. We have Josh Allen with his biggest week of 394 passing yards in the first game, 213 passing yards in the last game, and Spencer's been very consistent right around that 215 passing yard mark. Looking into the running backs, we have Alvin Kamara for New Orleans and James Cook for Buffalo. You have Alvin Kamara with 23.7 fantasy points, 36.3 PPR. You have James Cook with 59.5 fantasy points, 68.5 PPR. He's had no turnovers, but Alvin Kamara's had 1 receiving fumble. Looking at their averages, you have Alvin Kamara with 62 rushing yards per game on average, while with James Cook you have 94.6 average rushing yards per game. Receiving wise, you also have Alvin Kamara with 15.6 receiving yards per game, and James Cook with 23.6 receiving yards per game. Just a quick summary of the week breakdown for each of them. You had Alvin Kamara with 42 and 45 in both games and 99 in one other game. And James Cook had 44 in the first game with 132 in the second game and 108 last game. And just looking at the breakdown, you have 45 and 42 rushing yards for Alvin Kamara in the first and third week and 99 in the second week. And you have James Cook with 44 rushing yards in the first week, 132 of a high in the second week, but also over 100, 108 in the third week. Next up is the wide receivers. Here you have Chris Olave for New Orleans and Keon Coleman for Buffalo. Olave's had 16.5 fantasy points, 39.5 PPR. Coleman's had 21.8, 35.8 PPR. Neither of them have had any turnovers. Looking at their averages, Olave averages of 55 receiving yards per game, while Coleman averages 52.6 receiving yards per game. You have Olave with 54, 54, 57, so pretty consistent per game receiving yards. Coleman had 112 the first game and has had only 26 and 20 in the last couple games. With that said, Coleman still shares 25.9% of receiving yards, but that is well shared with other players like Josh Palmer and Kincaid, and Shakir. With Olave, that 54-54-57 comes out to still be 34.39% of the receiving share, which is still the largest for the team. The tight ends for both teams are Juwan Johnson on New Orleans and Dalton Kincaid on Buffalo. You have Johnson with 23.6 fantasy points, 42.6 PPR. Kincaid with 27.1, 40.1 PPR. You have neither of them losing a fumble this year. On average, Juwan Johnson gets 58.6 receiving yards per game. Kincaid, on average, gets 50.3 receiving yards per game. The breakdown is Juwan Johnson got 76 receiving yards in the first game, 49 in the second, 51 in the third. Kincaid's had 48 receiving yards in the first game, 37 in the second, and 66 in the third. Kincaid down here with 16.6 receiving share for the team, and Juwan Johnson with 19.5 receiving share. The next game's going to be Cleveland at Detroit. This week, you have Detroit pretty heavily favored on the money line with a spread of 10 points and a total line of 44.5 points. You have Cleveland with a passing ranking of 16, a rushing rank of 27, a allowed passing rank of 5, and a allowed rushing rank of 2. So they're pretty stout defensively. On Detroit's side, you have a passing rank of 9 and a rushing rank of 4. They have a allowed passing rank of 21 and a allowed rushing rank of 11. If we break that offensively down, you have Cleveland with 216 passing yards per game and 86.6 rushing yards per game. They've given up 4 interceptions so far, and they on average suffer 2 sacks per game. On Detroit's side, you average 153.6 passing yards per game, and you average 149 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 interception that they've thrown, and they suffer on average 1.3 sacks per game. Looking at them defensively, Cleveland on average allows only 173.6 passing yards per game, and their defense has only allowed 57.3 rushing yards per game, while Detroit has allowed 236.6 passing yards per game on average, and almost 100 rushing yards per game. Cleveland averages 6.3 QB hits per game, and Detroit only averages 4.3 QB hits per game. Their defenses have had the same amount of interceptions, and they each average 3 and 2 sacks per game. And for the quarterbacks, we have Joe Flacco on the Browns, Jared Goff on Detroit. Joe Flacco with 24.6 fantasy points, and Jared Goff with 57.5 fantasy points. You have Joe Flacco with 4 interceptions and 6 sacks suffered, and a sack fumble loss. While you have Jared Goff with a passing interception, 4 sacks suffered. You have Jared Goff with a passing interception and 4 sacks suffered. For Joe Flacco, we have 210 passing yards per game, and Goff with 253 passing yards per game, both of them averaging less than 5 yards rushing per game. Joe Flacco has 290 passing yards in the first game, 199 in the second, 142 in the third, and Jared Goff has stayed above 200 with 202 last game, 334 with his highest game. So for the running backs, we have Judkins over here listed as the starter for Cleveland. And you have over here Gibbs, but we all know that he shares a lot with Montgomery. So Judkins has 22.6 fantasy points, 26.6 PPR. Jahmyr Gibbs has 43.3 fantasy points, 61.3 PPR. Neither of them have any turnovers. You have Judkins with 51.6 rushing yards per game, and Jahmyr Gibbs with 60 rushing yards per game. You don't have much in the way of receiving yards per game, under 5 yards receiving yards per game for Judkins. But you do have almost 25 receiving yards per game for Jahmyr Gibbs. Bringing it down, you have Judkins only with 2 weeks, 61 rushing yards in the second week. You have 61 rushing yards in the second week, and 94 last week with a rushing touchdown. Here for our wide receivers, we have Jerry Jeudy with 13.4 fantasy points, 23.4 PPR, and Amon-Ra with 48.4 fantasy points, 68.4 PPR. Neither of them have given up any turnovers. You have 44.6 receiving yards per game on average for Jerry Jeudy, and you have on average 79 receiving yards for Amon-Ra. Breaking it down, you have 66 yards in the first week for Jerry Jeudy, 51 in the second, 17 last week. For Amon-Ra, you had 45, then 115, then 77 last week. Amon-Ra shares about a third of his team's yards, with the other third going to Williams. Jerry Jeudy, similar number, at 35% of his receiving yards for his team. The tight ends for each team are David Njoku and Sam Laporta. with Nyoku getting 11.7 fantasy points, 23.7 PPR, and Sam Laporta getting 13.8 fantasy points, 26.8 PPR. Neither of them have had a turnover. You have Nyoku getting an average of 39 yards per game, and Sam Laporta getting an average of 46 yards per game. Nyoku gets 37 receiving yards in the first game, 40 in the second, and 40 in the third game. That comes out to be a share of about 12%, even though it doesn't show up here, I think. 12 to 15%. Sam Laporta has 79 receiving yards in the first game, 26 in the second, 33 in the third, and that's 13.6 as a percentage of what his team gets. The fourth game on our list is Tennessee at Houston. Here we have Houston favored on the money line with a spread of 7 points and a point line of 39.5 points in this game. You have Tennessee with a passing rank of 28, a rushing rank of 26, an allowed passing rank of 20, an allowed rushing rank of 29. Houston has a passing rank of 23, a rushing rank of 21, an allowed passing rank of 18, an allowed rushing rank of 16. So either middle to below average on everything for both teams. If we look at the averages, for Tennessee you have an average of 168 passing yards per game with an average of 88.6 rushing yards per game, 1 interception this season offensively. They average 5 sacks per game suffered. For Houston, you get almost 200 passing yards per game, 95 rushing yards per game. They do average an interception per game with 3 interceptions, and on average they suffer 2.66 sacks per game. Defensively, Tennessee allows 234 passing yards per game and 145.6 rushing yards per game, while Houston allows 227 passing yards per game and 109 rushing yards per game. 4.33 QB hits on average per game for Tennessee, 5.66 average QB hits per game for Houston. Tennessee is averaging an interception per game, where Houston's only had 1 interception all season. Houston does average 3 sacks per game, while Tennessee doesn't even average 1 sack per game. Diving into the quarterbacks, we have Cam Ward for Tennessee and CJ Stroud for Houston. Cam Ward has 42.2 fantasy points. CJ Stroud has 34.1 fantasy points. Cam Ward has 1 passing interception and 15 sacks suffered. That's the largest I've seen so far. He's had 2 sack fumbles lost for 3 turnovers. You have CJ Stroud also with 3 interceptions and 3 total turnovers. At their averages, you have 168.6 average passing yards per game for Cam Ward and almost 200 passing yards per game for CJ Stroud. And CJ Stroud averages 27 rushing yards per game. Cam Ward only has about 7 rushing yards per game. Cam Ward got most of his yards in last game with 219 and has been increasing since his low at 112 in the first game. Meanwhile, CJ Stroud has been staying pretty average, right around that 200 mark for every single game. And taking a look at the running backs, you have Tony Pollard and Nick Chubb. Pollard with 28 fantasy points, 31 PPR. Nick Chubb with 23 fantasy points, 28 PPR. You have Tony Pollard with 1 fumble that was lost and nothing for Nick Chubb. For their averages, you have 65.6 average rushing yards for Tony Pollard and 47 rushing yards average for Chubb. You have Tony Pollard with almost 15 average receiving yards per game and Nick Chubb with about 10 average receiving yards per game. With a quick breakdown of their yardage per week, you have Tony Pollard's best week, the second week at 92 yards, and last week with 45 yards as his low. With Chubb, you have his best week as his first week with 60, and last week it was his low at 38. The number 1 listed receivers are Calvin Ridley for Tennessee and Nico Collins for Houston. Calvin Ridley has had 11 fantasy points, 19 PPR, and Nico Collins with 28 fantasy points, 42 PPR. Calvin Ridley's had no fumbles, but Nico Collins has lost a fumble. Their averages are 37 receiving yards per game for Calvin Ridley and 60 receiving yards per game on average for Nico Collins. Breaking that down, Calvin Ridley had his best week with 57 yards in the second week, and the other 2 weeks averaged exactly the same at 27 yards. That still is 1/3 of his team's yard share, which is shared with Ellick, who maybe we'll look into at some point in the future. On Nico's side, you have his worst week with the first week at 25 receiving yards, and his best week last week at 104, and he has the largest share of receiving yards for his team. For the next game, we have Carolina at New England. For this game, you have the Patriots favored on the money line with a spread of 5.5 and a total line of 42.5 points. Carolina has a passing rank of 22, a rushing rank of 23, an allowed passing rank of 13, an allowed rushing rank of 25. The Patriots have a passing rank of 7, rushing rank of 18, allowed passing rank of 30, and allowed rushing rank of 3. Looking at their averages, you have Carolina averaging 201 passing yards per game. Here you have Carolina averaging 201 passing yards per game and almost 91 rushing yards per game. They do average 1 passing interception per game and suffer 1.66 sacks per game. The Patriots average 261 passing yards per game, and they average 100 rushing yards per game. They've had 2 interceptions this game and suffer an average of 4 sacks per game. Defensively, you have Carolina allowing almost 200 passing yards per game and 138 rushing yards per game, while the Patriots average a whopping 272 passing yards per game and 60 rushing yards per game. Carolina only hits the QB 2.3 times per game, while the Patriots hit the QB 5.6 times per game. The Patriots have averaged 1 interception per game, and Carolina has actually averaged over 1 interception per game. The Patriots do have 3 defensive stacks on average per game, while Carolina doesn't even average 1 defensive stack per game. For the quarterback matchup, we have Bryce Young with Tennessee and Drake May with New England. Young has 41.1 fantasy points, while Drake May has 60.3 fantasy points. Young's had 3 interceptions, 5 suffered sacks, and 1 rushing fumble, and 1 sack fumble. So Bryce Young has had a total of 5 turnovers. Meanwhile, with Drake May, you've had 2 interceptions, 12 sacks suffered, 2 fumbles, 1 resulting in a loss. So 3 turnovers total. Looking at the season averages, you have 201 passing yards on average for Bryce Young, and averaging 16.6 rushing yards per game. Drake May averages 261 passing yards per game. He gets on average 29 rushing yards per game, and he's even had a reception. But yeah, Drake May's stayed above, 200 the whole time. 230 is his lowest, with 287 his highest. With Bryce Young, you have his biggest week at 328 at week 2 with Arizona. Otherwise, he's stuck around about 150. For the running backs, on Carolina's side, you have Chuba Hubbard. On New England, you have Stevenson. Hubbard gets 36.2 fantasy points, 46.2 PPR, and Stevenson's had 20 fantasy points, 30 PPR. Stevenson's had and lost 2 fumbles, while Chuba's had none. Looking at their averages, we have Chuba getting 56. We have Chuba getting 56 rushing yards on average and getting 25 receiving yards on average, while Stevenson gets 29 rushing yards on average. I believe they run a committee, so it's hard to say that anybody gets a lot of rushing yards from the Patriots when they already have a low amount to share between them all. But Stevenson does have, on average, 46 receiving yards per game. Breaking it down, Chuba gets 57, 38, and 37 rushing yards per game. Breaking it down, Chuba had his worst week on week 2 with 38 rushing yards, and his best week last week was 73. Stevenson had week 1 and 3 with 15 and 18, and 54 in week 2. You got 88 receiving yards in that week 2 as well, and 38 last week. It'd be cool to add a share of rushing yards and carries and everything. For the running backs specifically, matching up the number 1 receivers, you have McMillan and Diggs. McMillan with 21.6, 35.6 fantasy points PPR, and Diggs with 11.2, 24.2 PPR fantasy points. If we break it down, McMillan on average gets 72 receiving yards per game, while Diggs only gets 37.3 receiving yards per game. Diggs getting 57 receiving yards in the first game, then 32, then 23, so just declining. And he does not hold the largest share of the team, but it is pretty spread out. So Drake May's been really using a lot of different targets. Over here, McMillan's had 68 receiving yards in the first game, 100 in the second, then 48 in the third, and he does hold that largest share of receiving yards. And a quick look at the tight ends. We have Sanders for Carolina, Hunter Henry on New England. Sanders with 9.2 fantasy points, 20.2 PPR. Hunter Henry has 28.5 fantasy points, 41.1 PPR. Neither of them have lost a fumble. Looking at their averages, we have Sanders with an average of 30.6 receiving yards per game, while Hunter Henry averages 55 receiving yards per game. Sanders' best week was in week 2 with 54 yards, and last week with 11 yards, having a share of only 13% of the receiving yards. Hunter Henry has had 66 yards, his worst week with 9 yards in week 2, and last week with his best week with 90 yards. And with that, he has the largest share of receiving yards on the Patriots. The second to last game is the Chargers at the Giants. You have the Chargers favored on the money line over the Giants with a spread of 6 points and a total line of 43.5 points. You have the Chargers at the overall number 1 passing rank, a 22 rushing rank, a 12 allowed passing rank, and a 9 allowed rushing rank. The Giants here have a passing rank of 8, a rushing rank of 20, almost the worst allowed passing rank team, and almost the worst allowed rushing rank team. So this is about the worst defense in the league. Breaking it down, you have 286.6 average passing yards per game from the Chargers and 92 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 passing interception all season and suffer 3.3 sacks per game. The Giants have 259.3 passing yards per game. They average 96 rushing yards per game. They average 1 interception per game, and they average 2.3 sacks suffered per game. Defensively, you have the Chargers allowing 197 passing yards per game and 94.6 rushing yards per game, while the Giants allow 272 passing yards per game and 153 rushing yards per game. The Chargers get 5.6 QB hits per game, and the Giants get 6.3 QB hits per game. The Chargers have been averaging 1 interception per game, and they average the exact same amount of defensive sacks per game at 2.3. So looking at the quarterbacks, we had all of that data for Russell Wilson for the first 3 weeks. It says that Jackson Dart's going to start instead. So I brought up Jackson Dart's panel, and we have no data for him yet. So we have no idea to see what he's going to do. But we can still look at Justin Herbert, who's had 61.3 fantasy points, 1 passing interception, and has lost 1 rushing fumble. He averages 286.6 passing yards per game and averages 23 rushing yards per game. His best game was the first game this year with 318 passing yards, but last week he also had 300 passing yards. And for the running backs, we have Hampton, and I think it's Scattleboo is how you say his name, but I'll just call him Cam. For Hampton, you have 27.5 fantasy points, 36.5 in PPR. For Cam, you have 30.9 fantasy points, 40.9 in PPR. Neither of them have actually given up a turnover. Looking at their averages, you have 47.3 average rushing yards per game for Hampton. For Cam, you have 34 average rushing yards per game. Hampton almost averages 25 receiving yards per game, and Cam averages almost 30 receiving yards per game. Hampton's best rushing game was 70 yards, which occurred last week. Same goes for Cam with 60 yards last week. If we look at the starting receivers, we have McConkey here for the Chargers, and we have Neighbors for the Giants. McConkey has 16.3 fantasy points, 31.3 PPR. Neighbors has 37.1 fantasy points, 53.1 PPR. Neither of them have any turnovers. So looking at their averages, you have McConkey with 54.3 receiving yards per game, and you have Neighbors with 83.6 receiving yards per game. McConkey had his best week in the first week with 74 and has averaged about 45 since then. His share is 18.6%, which is overshadowed a little bit by, I think, Quentin Johnson and Keenan Allen. Neighbors, his best week was 167 in week 2, and his worst last week with 13. Still with all of that, Neighbors had his best week in the second week with 167 receiving yards, and his worst week last week with 13 receiving yards. He still owns the share of the team by large, with over half of the team's receiving yards. And looking at the tight ends, I think you have Gadsden for the Chargers, because I have Disley listed as he's out. So you have the one game that this guy played, which was against Denver in week 3, with 46 receiving yards. You also don't have much here with Theo Johnson, with no fumbles given up, only 4.9 fantasy points, 10.9 PPR, 16.3 average receiving yards, with his best week in week 2, and last week with 10 yards, very small share. So not much going on with the tight ends here. And moving into our last 1 o'clock game, we have Philadelphia at Tampa Bay. And on the team panel, we have the Eagles favored on the money line with a spread of 3.5 and a total point line of 44.5 points. Looking at their ranks, the Eagles' passing rank is 31, almost the worst in the whole league. Their rushing rank is 14. Their allowed passing rank is 8, and their allowed rushing rank is 24. With Tampa Bay, their passing rank is 20, their rushing rank is 7, their allowed passing rank is 19, and their allowed rushing rank is 7. Looking at the averages, you have the Eagles with 159.6 average passing yards per game, 122 rushing yards per game, no interceptions given up, and only 2.33 sacks suffered on average per game. Over here with Tampa Bay, you have on average 205 passing yards per game, with 130.6 rushing yards per game, also no passing interceptions given up, and only 2 sacks suffered on average per game. Defensively, you have the Eagles giving up 190.3 passing yards per game and 133 rushing yards per game, while you have Tampa Bay giving up 234 passing yards per game, but giving up much less, 84 rushing yards per game. The Eagles average 6 QB hits per game, and Tampa Bay averages 6.6 QB hits per game, with Tampa Bay having 1 interception and the Eagles' defense having 2 interceptions this season. The Eagles, though, only average 1 sack per game, and Tampa Bay averages 2.6 sacks per game. You have Hurts with the Eagles and Mayfield with Tampa Bay. Hurts getting 64.9 fantasy points, and Mayfield with 60.2. Hurts has suffered 7 sacks and lost 1 fumble when he was sacked. Mayfield has suffered 6 sacks, but has no turnovers. Looking in the averages, you have 159.67 passing yards per game for Hurts, and you have 39 rushing yards per game for Hurts. For Mayfield, you have an average of 205 passing yards per game, with also almost 39 rushing yards per game. Hurts' best week was last week with 226 yards passing, and Mayfield's best week was also last week with 233 yards passing. And onto the running backs, we have Saquon Barkley for Philadelphia and Bucky Irving for Tampa Bay. Barkley has 35.3 fantasy points, 45.3 PPR. Bucky Irving has 32.5 fantasy points, 46.5 PPR. So very similar numbers. They both have no turnovers. And if we look at the averages, Barkley's average rushing yards are 64.6 rushing yards per game. Bucky's are 58 rushing yards per game. Bucky also gets 30 receiving yards per game on average. And Barkley gets a much less 13 receiving yards per game. Barkley's best week was the second week with 88 rushing yards. And so was Bucky's with 71 rushing yards. And looking at the receivers, you have A.J. Brown and Emeka Egbuka, I think is how you say his name. Since you have Mike Evans out and Chris Godwin's questionable, and I'm having problems bringing up his stats for some reason, so we'll just take a look at him. And so for A.J. Brown, you have 20.4 fantasy points and 32.4 PPR. For Emeka, you have 37 fantasy points, 51 PPR. They both have no turnovers. Brown has 48 receiving yards on average per game, and Emeka has on average 60.3 receiving yards per game. His best game was last week with 85 receiving yards, as was A.J. Brown's with 109 receiving yards. A.J. Brown with that first week of only 8 receiving yards put a dent in some of his numbers. But despite that, he still owns 1/3, which is still the largest share too, of receiving yards, shared with Devontae Smith, I assume. And with Egbuka, you have 25% of the share, probably short of Mike Evans here. And then finally for our tight ends, we have Dallas Goedert and Cade Otton. Goddard has 17.3 fantasy points, 21.7 PPR, and Otton only has 2.5 fantasy points, 5.5 PPR. Neither of them have lost any fumbles. Neither of them have any turnovers. Goddard averages 25.6 receiving yards per game, but was out for one of those games. And Otton only averages 8.3 receiving yards per game, but was also out last game. Goddard's had 44 receiving yards and 33 receiving yards in the last couple games, while Otton's got all of his in the second game for 25 receiving yards. And with that, you have the conclusion of the morning game preview. I know there's a lot of information in there that probably took a little while, but just wanted to get everything in there for anybody that wanted to look at anything specifically. I hope you enjoyed. Give a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Give a comment on if there's anything else that you want to see. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching.